Hey guys, tonight we drift back, far back, to the crackling heat of the Persian desert. The air is dry enough to turn figs into dust and horses into crusty, wheezing statues. You're marching beside an army not of sandals and swords, but of bronze thunder and, yes, scented bathwater. Picture this. Alexander the Great, crowned in sun and ambition, leads a sunburnt trail of soldiers through what feels like the world's largest oven. And yet, somewhere amid the heat-stung horizon, amidst sandstorms and skirmishes, there's a glimmer of the absurd, a wagon packed with perfume oils. Why? Oh, we're getting to that. But first, a reality check. You probably wouldn't survive 3 days in that army. Between the scorching days, freezing nights, blistered feet, and lack of Netflix, you'd be begging for a scented towel and a nap on a fig crate. Luckily, tonight, you get the bath without the blisters. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, post your location and local time down in the comments. I love seeing where you're all tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge through the dust. Sand crunches under your boots. The air tastes like hot iron and camel frown. The endless march eastward, through lands where water is precious and shade is more legend than landscape, doesn't seem like the place for luxury. But then again, Alexander never did things the usual way. This is a man who studied under Aristotle by age 13, believed he was descended from Achilles, and named cities after himself, like a kid writing his name on every school book. He wasn't just building an empire, he was building a myth. So yes, when the sun beat down and morale cracked like dry pottery, he didn't just offer rest. He offered baths, fragrant ones. Now don't picture marble bathtubs and rubber ducks. These were makeshift affairs, shallow trenches filled with hauled-in water, wide bronze basins, or even just buckets over the head. What made them remarkable was what came after. Scents of myrrh, rose, frankincense, and something vaguely nutty that no one's quite been able to identify. Historians still argue whether this was all practical or just pomp. Was Alexander trying to preserve hygiene? Or distract weary soldiers with pleasant nonsense? Maybe both. One mainstream account suggests it started during the push through Bactria, when heat stroke and infections began to sap the men's strength faster than enemy arrows. The commanders needed something, anything, to break the physical toll. Scented baths weren't just indulgent, they masked rot, soothed skin rubbed raw by armor straps, and made camp life just a hair more tolerable. Still, this isn't the kind of thing your average Macedonian foot soldier had grown up with. Back home, a bath often involved a cold stream and a judgmental goat. Yet here, under Alexander, you had moments, strange rare ones, where a man might emerge from battle reeking not of blood, but of orange blossom. Here's the quirky bit. Some of the scent recipes came from Persia's own archives. One clay tablet unearthed much later even hinted at royal perfuming rituals that used crushed blue lotus petals, symbolizing transcendence and, rather unhelpfully, attracting bees. So why did Alexander care? Well, you've got to understand the theater of conquest. Alexander wasn't just conquering lands, he was absorbing cultures, performing power. And nothing says divine ruler quite like a general who smells nicer than most wedding guests. Well, he'd walked into the Persian capital of Persepolis and held a massive drunken feast there before burning it to the ground. Long story, we'll circle back. In that moment, he began mimicking Persian customs, from dress to ceremony, and yes, personal grooming. Some said it was to win the loyalty of Eastern subjects. Others said he just really liked how he looked in silks. Back to the sand. You and your comrades finally stop near a rocky outcrop that miraculously shelters a small spring. It's shallow, but clean. The officers nod, and soon, amid the cawing vultures and creaking leather armor, the soldiers begin to strip down and splash. Then comes the oil, applied carefully with cloths or hands, rubbed into cracked skin and sore joints. It's soothing, almost holy. The desert still looms, but now it smells like something out of a poet's dream. And somewhere on a nearby hill, Alexander watches, not as a distant king, but as a commander who knows when men need more than orders. They need ritual. They need to feel human again. A curious report from one later historian, whose name we won't mention because, honestly, it's very hard to pronounce when you're half asleep, even described how Alexander would occasionally join in, laughing with the men, pouring oil over his own hair, and then braiding it back like a relaxed sea god on shore leave. Whether that ever happened, or whether some scribe was just having a good day at the scroll desk, we'll never know. But the image remains. A bronze-haired king, in the middle of nowhere, turning a patch of scorched earth into a scented oasis. Not for glamour, not for weakness, but because, just maybe, survival isn't only about swords and rations. Sometimes it's about clinging to comfort, even when comfort smells faintly of lavender and camel sweat. You wake with sand in your eyelashes, the kind that stings when you blink too hard. The desert hasn't softened overnight. If anything, it's crankier. The sun hasn't even peeked over the hills yet, and the heat already presses against your chest like a warm goat trying to cuddle. The army stirs. Shields clink, boots scrape, someone sneezes and scares off a scorpion. And yet, a faint trace of sandalwood still clings to your fingertips. The scented baths of yesterday haven't just washed the dust away. They've left a lingering spell. It's the smell of something gentler, almost sacred. It makes you feel, dare you say it, a little like royalty, or at least like someone whose socks don't smell like boiled olives. Now, Alexander wasn't exactly running a spa retreat. His tactics were sharp, his marches brutal, but he was, in many ways, a master psychologist. He knew armies didn't just run on rations and revenge. They needed belief, not only in the mission, but in their own place within it. And so enter scent, not as decoration, but as subtle sorcery. You see, back in Macedonia, you didn't really smell anything pleasant unless it came from a feast or a funeral. Most soldiers bathed when it rained and relied on campfire smoke to cover up whatever horrors were stewing under their armor. But now they were in the East, where scent was a language, a weapon even. The Persians believed in it. The Egyptians practically bottled their gods. And Alexander? He noticed. That's when the aromatic strategy began. One mainstream historical account tells of how, after capturing Babylon, Alexander walked through temple halls filled with burning incense and perfumed fountains. Not long after, fragrant oils began appearing in camp, gifts from nobles, looted stockpiles, maybe even a bit of indulgence from the king's own satchels. What started as a curiosity became policy. He didn't just give orders, he created experience. And that experience was immersive. The baths became a ritual, a reward, something that turned hardened men into a whispering community, their bodies sore but their spirits lightened by the simple act of shared comfort. A general could deliver a long speech about unity, or he could hand a man a warm cloth and a flask of cedar oil and let that message soak in through the skin. Historians still argue whether this made any measurable difference to morale. Some claim it was wasteful, absurd, even dangerous. Imagine hauling hundreds of jars of perfume across enemy territory while your men ate boiled lentils and cursed the weather. Others say it was brilliant, a rare example of emotional warfare, waged not with blades, but with rosemary and rosewater. What we do know is that something changed. Veteran soldiers who once scoffed at luxuries began to expect the baths. They didn't always get them, of course. Sometimes the terrain was too harsh or the water too scarce. But when the moment came, the ritual mattered. And the scent? Oh, it did more than tickle noses. Smell, after all, is memory. And for soldiers living day after brutal day in foreign lands, the baths became anchors. A specific blend of cinnamon and resin might remind them of a victory outside Tyre. A hint of bergamot could take them back to the feast before the push into Egypt. The battlefield was chaos, but the scent, that stayed. There's one particularly quirky account from a minor officer who scribbled notes on wax tablets. According to him, one soldier refused to enter battle unless he'd been rubbed with a specific musk that reminded him of his grandmother's kitchen. Was it superstition? Probably. But in a world where gods whispered from clouds and stars, superstition was just another word for comfort. The camaraderie deepened. Men started trading oil blends like wine. "Swap you my jasmine for a sniff of that fig one," they'd murmur before dozing off. Even horses apparently got a bit of the treatment, especially the prized ones. Now, let's talk tension. As the army grew, absorbing mercenaries, Eastern allies, former enemies, the risk of internal division ballooned. Language barriers, cultural friction, and the very human habit of side-eyeing anyone who seasons their food differently made unity fragile. But scent? That didn't need translation. The baths were among the rare shared customs that didn't originate in violence. They weren't forced, they were welcomed. A Parthian archer and a Macedonian spearman could sit in silence, elbows in the same warm basin, the air around them clouded with the same faint perfume. And for a while, they were just tired humans soaking off the world. This is where the idea of smell as loyalty begins to emerge. You didn't just march under Alexander, you smelled like Alexander's army. And in a world without uniforms or ID cards, that meant something. One military historian, again name unpronounceable, bless him, described this phenomenon as olfactory branding. And yes, we laughed too, but it stuck. The idea that scent could carry identity, memory, and allegiance wasn't new to Eastern traditions, but to the Greeks, revolutionary. And Alexander, he was fluent in revolution. So next time you imagine an ancient army, don't just see iron helmets and bronze shields. Picture men gathered at dusk, kneeling by stone basins, rubbing oil into sunburnt skin, their voices low and drowsy. Picture the desert, not just as an enemy, but as a backdrop for moments of surprising grace. Picture the scent, a soft fusion of clove, mint, and something floral you can't quite name, carried on the wind long after the soldiers have moved on. You shuffle behind a camel that smells like regret and bad decisions. The heat today is sharper, less dry toast and more open oven door. The horizon is a pale shimmer. Someone mutters that it's cooler inside a volcano. You don't disagree. But here's the odd part. In the middle of all this, blisters, broken sandals, the occasional passive-aggressive vulture, there's a cart. And not just any cart. This one creaks and tilts with the weight of clay jars and brass amphora, each sealed and padded like treasure. And inside, perfume, oil, fragrance, scented luxuries being hauled across a desert by a donkey named, rumor has it, Lysimachus the Flatulent. Yes, it sounds absurd. It was absurd. And yet, it was real. One mainstream fact most people miss is that Alexander's supply chains were marvels of their time. We often picture armies as wild, chaotic swarms, but Alexander's was a logistical machine. Every 100 men had supply captains, inventory scribes, and designated water scouts. Behind the front lines moved wagons filled with tents, tools, food, and yes, those fragrant jars. Some of the oils came from conquered cities, Babylon, Susa, even obscure mountain towns with only 3 goats and an attitude. Others were imported all the way from India and Egypt, carried in camel caravans so slow they made snails look impulsive. Myrrh, spikenard, cinnamon leaf, cedar oil, each sealed tightly against the sun and wrapped in cloth soaked in vinegar to keep the heat out. Historians still argue whether Alexander personally ordered the oils as part of a grand strategy, or if it was something that evolved as luxury became habit. But records from royal quartermasters mention entire wagons labeled simply aromata. Aromata. That's right, a whole military subdivision of smelling nice. And while they were technically non-essential, no one dared raid the aromatics cart. It had its own guards. Once, a pair of infantrymen tried to borrow a bottle of lily oil, thinking no one would notice. They were reassigned to camel duty. And not the good camels. Now imagine this. You're a foot soldier, 20 miles into a forced march, tongue stuck to your teeth like a barnacle. Suddenly you catch a breeze, not of sweat and dust, but of wild thyme and sweet almond. You know what that means. You're close to camp. That scent wasn't just pleasure, it was direction, a marker, even a kind of promise. When the scent reached you, it whispered, soon you'll rest, soon you'll soak. Soon, someone will rub your shoulders with something that doesn't smell like boiled sandal. That's how the scented bath became a waypost, a milestone in a soldier's week. Even animals got in on the routine. One particularly memorable report describes Alexander's own war elephant being rubbed down with peppermint oil after battle. Not for vanity, but to soothe cracked skin. And one might assume to help everyone forget that the creature had recently trampled 3 carts and a shrubbery. Here's a quirky fringe detail. Some soldiers began mixing local herbs into their oil rations, creating little signature scents. One guy in the 5th phalanx added crushed dates. Another swore by honey and a drop of goat's milk. Did it work? No one knows. But it sparked a kind of olfactory arms race. Who could smell the most heroic? Even more curious, some Eastern allies adopted the habit too. Persian cavalrymen, once suspicious of the bath rituals, began requesting their own oil rations. Not long after, supply carts carried double. 1 batch for the Macedonians, 1 for the satraps. It became, in its own strange way, a diplomatic olive branch, or olive oil branch to be precise. The irony? Back home in Greece, this would have been ridiculed. Spartan soldiers bathed only when absolutely necessary and considered olive oil a food group, not a facial serum. But here, in the wilds of Central Asia, Alexander's army became a scented brotherhood. The cultural crossover didn't stop at oils. Soon, Persian bath techniques crept in: heated stones, tented steam pits, rosewater foot soaks. There's even some evidence that Alexander encouraged these rituals as bonding experiences, creating a neutral space where officers and footmen mingled, stripped of rank, unified by sore muscles and soft skin. But not everyone loved it. Some of the older Macedonian generals, men who'd grown up thinking comfort was a wooden bed instead of a rock, grumbled about all the fuss. "What next?" they'd mutter. "Nail polish?" One famously snorted that if Alexander spent less time smelling like a flower and more time acting like one, they'd be home already. Still, the system worked, and the wagons rolled on. Now let's pause for a moment and admire the absurd brilliance of this setup. You've got the greatest military force of its time, moving through deadly terrain, facing ambushes, famine, plague, and they've budgeted space and time for spa days. Not every night, of course. There were plenty of evenings spent huddled in sandstorms, dreaming of figs. But when it happened, it mattered. And the scent? It wasn't just for the soldiers. It wafted out ahead of them, reaching villages before the army even arrived. It softened fear, gave them an aura of mystery, even divinity. One Eastern chronicler, more poet than historian, wrote that when Alexander's army came, they did not smell of smoke, but of gods. Whether that's exaggeration or early PR, it tells us something. To the locals, this wasn't just a foreign horde. It was a scented phenomenon. And you, exhausted and sore and weirdly smooth-skinned, crawl into your blanket that night under a sky so vast it makes your bones ache. And you smell like cinnamon and triumph. You don't expect the oasis. After days of marching across a world made entirely of beige, beige sand, beige wind, beige hope, you've resigned yourself to more dust and more boiled lentils. But there it is, a glimmer. Not a mirage this time, but an actual pool, nestled between two rocky ridges, cradled by a sparse grove of tamarisk trees. The water isn't deep, but it's clear and shaded. The scent hits you before the sight does. A flutter of jasmine, a whisper of warmed citrus peel. You blink twice, just to be sure your nose hasn't lost its mind. It hasn't. The camp erupts into a kind of reverent chaos. Men shedding their armor with the urgency of toddlers late to a birthday party. Tunics flung over branches, boots kicked off with sighs of ancient weariness. And there, standing to the side with that practiced calm of someone who knows exactly what he's doing, is one of Alexander's bathing stewards, gently uncorking a flask the size of a melon. This is not just a bath. This is the bath. The one men will talk about 3 campaigns from now. And in the middle of it all, a general, silver-bearded, famously grumpy, and allergic to smiling, gasps audibly as warm jasmine oil is poured over his battle-worn back. This is not fiction. Multiple ancient sources refer to Alexander's occasional rest oases, moments where the army was granted full-body respite. Some of them were deliberately timed, after particularly brutal stretches, or before delicate negotiations. It was physical recovery meets soft diplomacy. Historians still argue whether this one bath near the Gedrosian frontier was real or exaggerated by a particularly poetic scribe. But the tale lingers. Hundreds of men, slick with oil, laughing like boys, muscles twitching under the soft massage of camp assistants who'd once doubled as scribes or scouts. Even Alexander, they say, wandered through the crowd in sandals and no crown, flicking water at one of his commanders and narrowly avoiding a retaliatory splash from a very naked cavalryman. Let's not forget, this is the same Alexander who charged into battles with split armor and once broke his leg jumping down a ravine. So, to imagine him ankle-deep in jasmine-scented water, sharing citrus with a former Thracian rebel, is oddly believable. That was the magic of these moments. They weren't just about hygiene or morale, they were about dissolving rank. Everyone looked ridiculous with wet hair and prune fingers. The army that marched like clockwork suddenly giggled like schoolboys. And beneath that, something vital happened. Walls came down. A quick aside, there's a fun fringe theory from a later Greek writer who claimed Alexander developed these scented group baths as a strategy to detect spies. The logic being, in moments of relaxation, people slip up. They talk too freely, let their accents or loyalties show. Was it true? Who knows? But if so, it's the coziest intelligence gathering method in military history. You're handed a small cloth dipped in warm rose oil. You dab your face, feel the sting of old sunburn, and then the cool relief. Nearby, someone sings off-key. Someone else is telling a joke about a one-eyed satrap and a goat. And through it all drifts that ever-present scent. Jasmine, layered with something citrusy and faintly sweet, like the peel of a pomegranate. The supplies for this bath? Carted in over 2 weeks by a supply team consisting of 3 camels, 1 slightly offended mule, and a crew of very committed water carriers. Some of the oils were diluted with wine, another trick learned from the Persians, who believed that wine extended the aroma and warded off certain desert insects. Whether that's science or superstition, it smelled divine. The general who gasped earlier? He's now lying on a flat rock, eyes closed, murmuring something about how this beats sleeping next to his cousin back home. Not everyone takes part. A few stubborn veterans lounge in the shade, carving bits of dried meat and grumbling about how real warriors don't soak. But they still linger close enough to breathe in the scent. Close enough to remember that the battlefield isn't the only place where bonds are forged. A young scribe walks by, holding a basket of mint leaves. You ask him where they came from. He shrugs and points east. Somewhere with less wind and more bees, he says. There's something luxurious about not needing to know the exact answer. And while it's easy to laugh now, to think of this as a break in an otherwise harsh campaign, it's also a reminder. These men weren't just muscle and iron. They were human, sunburned, homesick, tired of eating sand with every bite of bread. And Alexander, for all his ambition and chaos, gave them moments like this. Not just to recover, but to feel part of something gentler than conquest. Later that night, after the oil has dried and the laughter has faded into soft snoring, you lie back on a rolled cloak and breathe in. Your skin smells faintly of flowers. Your hair somehow doesn't feel like straw for once. Above you, the stars blink slowly. A warm breeze rolls past, and for a second, you forget the names of the towns you've burned, the long path ahead, and the fact that someone still owes you a boiled egg from last week's rations. You are still in a war, but tonight, for one strange and scented hour, you were simply a man in a bath, laughing in the desert. You wake the next morning with your skin soft and your morale weirdly high. The scent of jasmine still lingers faintly in the crook of your elbow, mingling with the smell of sun-warmed leather and last night's date cakes. Around you, the camp stirs, not groaning this time, but humming. A few men are even smiling. One starts whistling. That never happens unless someone found honey. But you notice something else too, something subtle. The air around you has changed. It's not just about relaxation anymore. It's about message, identity, something deeper. Enter Persian nose politics. When Alexander entered Persia, he didn't just march through cities, he absorbed them. Like some olive oil-soaked sponge of ambition, he soaked up language, ritual, architecture, and yes, personal grooming customs. The Persians, especially the elites, had an entire philosophy around scent. A well-perfumed man wasn't just clean, he was cultured, powerful, divine. And Alexander? He wasn't just copying for fun, he was performing diplomacy with his pores. Back in Babylon, it was recorded by more than one dusty, ink-stained scribe that Alexander didn't just sit on the throne. He adopted Persian attire, loose silk robes, jeweled belts, even eyeliner, which, to be fair, looked fantastic. But what really turned heads was how he began arriving to state events already perfumed. This wasn't random. To the Persian court, scent was a form of presence. A person's fragrance carried status. Entering a room already fragrant was like walking in with a choir singing your name. It wasn't optional. It was expected. And the fact that Alexander leaned into it, well, that told the satraps and high priests something important. He wasn't just conquering Persia. He was becoming it. Historians still argue whether this was a savvy political move or the early symptoms of megalomania. Some Greek officers certainly weren't pleased. One general famously stormed out of a banquet, yelling something about rose oil being for women and dead poets. But Alexander didn't flinch. He wore scent like armor. He used it like a calling card. And here's the strange, soft power of it. It worked. Persian nobles who might have plotted rebellion paused, not because of swords, but because Alexander smelled like a man who belonged. He understood the culture down to its invisible rituals. He didn't just look the part, he scented it. Now imagine this playing out across the empire. You've got Macedonian soldiers rubbing themselves with oils they once mocked, sitting in bath tents decorated with imported drapery, trading advice on how long to let rose oil steep in the sun. You've got Persian cavalrymen raising an eyebrow and muttering, not bad. And you've got Alexander in the middle of it all, straddling cultures, tying them together with the invisible thread of fragrance. A quick quirky note. In one letter unearthed decades ago, likely forged but delightful, a camp steward described the great debate over sandalwood versus myrrh. Apparently, Alexander preferred myrrh in the morning, sandalwood at night. Too spicy for sunrise, he supposedly wrote, like waking to cinnamon and insults. Whether he actually wrote that or not, the image is irresistible, but not everyone played along. Greek philosophers, dragged eastward under royal invitation, grumbled endlessly. One particularly cranky Stoic complained that Alexander bathes more than he thinks. Harsh, but also, what's wrong with a nice bath, Theon? Even among his own officers, some doubted the scented shift. They muttered that it softened the troops, dulled their edges, that men who smelled like lilac wouldn't charge into battle with the same fury. But the truth? They did. Maybe even more so. Because behind the scent was solidarity, ritual, identity. You weren't just a soldier, you were Alexander's soldier. You carried his vision in your muscles, his scent on your skin. And when you walked into a village, the locals didn't just see you coming, they smelled you and knew these were the king's men. One mainstream account tells of an emissary from Sogdiana who arrived late to a parley. The moment he entered the tent, he froze. Not because of the gold or the armor or the sheer number of very sharp spears, but because of the scent, faint, warm, unfamiliar. He turned to his translator and said, "It smells like the gods are here." Alexander apparently smiled. "Just me," he said, "but I'll take the compliment." You can see the strategy, can't you? By controlling the sensory environment, even the invisible one, Alexander shaped perception. He turned his army into a moving myth. Not just powerful, not just skilled, but almost otherworldly. And while swords rust and armor dents, scent lingers. Even now, thousands of years later, buried deep in scrolls and legend, we're still sniffing the edge of that legacy. So tonight, when you unroll your blanket and stretch your perfumed limbs under a sky crackling with stars, remember, you're not just part of a conquest. You're part of a pageant. You are a walking message, a scented envoy, a soldier with sandalwood on your collar. The stars feel closer tonight. Maybe it's the altitude. Maybe it's the lack of tents. Or maybe it's the way the warm breeze carries not just the chill of coming dawn, but the soft scent of last evening's basil oil, still clinging faintly to your skin like the ghost of a dream you can't quite place. You're tired. Not the kind of tired that sleep fixes, but the kind that nestles into your shoulders and ribs like a second skeleton. And yet, you feel lighter. The ritual has returned. You soaked. You breathed in steam infused with dried fig leaves. Someone even found a way to warm a rock and pour melted beeswax over it for a sort of impromptu incense moment that absolutely backfired but smelled incredible for 8 minutes. You've begun to notice something. These baths aren't just for bodies anymore. They're becoming sacred. Alexander, for all his worldly ambition, had a spiritual streak that could rival a mountain monk. He wasn't content to be a king. He wanted to be a myth. He studied omens, consulted oracles, traced his bloodline to Achilles and Heracles, and maybe, on a bold day, even to Zeus himself. And in that belief, he wasn't alone. His men, too, craved signs, blessings, patterns in the dust. And so the baths, once just a source of relief, became something else entirely. They became temples, not the stone kind, with columns and chanting, but temples of steam and scent. Places where men could shed more than sweat, where burdens were rinsed away, along with grime and grief. Where silence wasn't awkward, it was reverent. Historians still debate whether Alexander encouraged this shift or simply allowed it. Some accounts suggest that before major battles, he would retreat to a tent where incense burned in slow, swirling ribbons, and he would pour oil over his hands and whisper to gods both Greek and foreign. Was it devotion? Theater? A bit of both. One mainstream account from a Babylonian priest described Alexander's pre-battle rituals as equal parts warrior and priest, noting that he carried vials of specific oils, each one linked to a different deity. cypress for courage, lavender for clarity, myrrh for victory. Probably smelled like an herbal apothecary on steroids. It wasn't just Alexander either. His men began weaving belief into the bathing. Some would refuse to be rubbed down by anyone other than their usual blesser, often just a fellow soldier with warm hands and a steady voice. Others would chant small prayers as the oil was applied. Not loud, not dramatic, just soft words into the steam. To Athena, to Apollo, to ancestors they hadn't spoken to in years. And then there was Dionysus. Ah yes, the god of wine, madness, and long, excellent naps. His cult was especially fond of oils. Fragrance was part of the rite. And Alexander, whose mother Olympias had a very dramatic streak, was no stranger to Dionysian rituals. Some whispered he believed the god followed him, that every scent of crushed grape or flowering vine was a divine wink. So when the bath tents began to echo with lazy humming, laughter, and the clink of bronze cups filled with whatever wasn't water, it didn't feel like idleness. It felt like worship. There's even a fringe account, scribbled in what appears to be wine-stained shorthand, that describes a particularly enthusiastic bath night in Carmania. After a hard march and harder victory, the army settled in for a spiritual rest. What followed was an all-night gathering that blurred the line between feast, bath, and temple. Soldiers anointed themselves, danced, told stories of dreams they'd had the night before, each scent in the air like a breadcrumb trail leading back to something sacred. Someone reportedly rode a donkey into camp, wearing nothing but fig leaves and a crown. Alexander watched, nodded, and said, "Even the gods need a joke." And just like that, scent was no longer just comfort. It was communion. Remember the lemon balm oil you shared with that archer from Sogdiana? Turns out it was traditionally used in his village during wedding ceremonies. You didn't know. He didn't say. But he smiled when you handed it to him, and you both understood something passed between you that was more than scent. It was memory, story, shared ground. This is where it all begins to blend: ritual, rest, and religion. The smell of cedar becomes a shield for the spirit. The drop of eucalyptus on your temples feels like an offering to Apollo. The warm towel across your neck might as well be the hand of a kindly ancestor. You no longer bathe just to wash. You bathe to remember that you are more than a blade, more than a boot print in the sand. You are part of something wider. War can make you forget that. Alexander knew that, and so he made the bath sacred, not with grand declarations, but with space. Permission. A few flasks of oil in the right hands, a tent warmed by breath and belief. A reminder that the gods don't always speak in thunder. Sometimes they murmur in lavender steam. So tonight, as the moon turns the camp silver and the breeze carries the faint scent of rosemary across your chest, you feel something quiet inside you exhale. The stars look close again, but so does the divine. You're halfway through tying your sandals when the complaining starts. Not the usual grunts about blistered heels or dry lentils, but a full-on philosophical grumble fest, delivered by a man whose beard probably predates Alexander's conquests. "It's the baths," he growls, adjusting his belt like it personally betrayed him. "Too soft. Men aren't meant to smell like orchards." You sigh. Here we go again. Not everyone's been thrilled about the new scented normal. For every soldier who rubbed chamomile oil into his scalp and called it divine relief, there's a veteran who sees it as a slippery slope to moral collapse. And today, those veterans are especially vocal. The elder Macedonians, the ones who followed Alexander's father Philip II, weren't raised on luxuries. Their idea of self-care was surviving the week without losing a toe to frostbite. So naturally, the sight of grown men massaging sandalwood into each other's shoulders makes their blood pressure spike. One of them even claims scented oils are making the army slower. "You slip on a rose petal in battle, you're done," he mutters, to nobody in particular. Historians still argue whether there was an actual divide in morale between the old guard and the newer recruits who embraced Alexander's more Eastern lifestyle. But the accounts are clear. As the rituals of scent and steam expanded, so did the eye rolls. Still, Alexander pressed on. Because for every critic, there were 10 sleepy soldiers drifting off to dreams that didn't reek of sweat and fear. But criticism came from more than grumpy warriors. Philosophers, dragged from Athens and other wise-sounding places, were horrified. These were men raised on stoicism, who believed virtue was built through suffering, and who thought bathing was a suspicious act best reserved for after funerals. One particularly spicy Athenian wrote in a letter, which, to be honest, reads more like a Yelp review. This army has begun to smell like Babylon itself, perfumed, decadent, and unready. And yet, Babylon was the very city Alexander had conquered, and then tried to unify through cultural blending. The baths weren't just indulgent, they were political tools. Scent was a handshake. Steam was diplomacy. A warm cloth soaked in frankincense said more than 100 coin bribes ever could. But the skeptics had a point. Not all soldiers responded the same way. Some younger recruits took it too far, trading armor polish for scented balms, refusing to train because they just oiled their joints, and spending a little too much time braiding each other's hair. There was a memorable incident involving two men, a vat of rose oil, and a small folding mirror that mysteriously went missing after that evening. Quirky story alert. One quartermaster reportedly had to ration oil more strictly after finding several soldiers had taken to scent duels, competitive spritz-offs judged by a very biased goat. Still, for the most part, the baths didn't soften the army. They smoothed it. The smell of perfume became a recognizable trait. Villagers would say, "The sweet wind comes first, and then the king's men." It was a kind of branding, a soft signal that this wasn't a wild horde, but an organized, near-mythical force that conquered and bathed, possibly in that order. But beneath the scented peace, tensions bubbled. Some saw Alexander's embrace of Persian customs, like incense-heavy ceremonies, bejeweled robes, and bowing rituals, as betrayal. "We're not Easterners," they'd hiss around campfires. "We're Greeks, Macedonians. We don't bow. We don't perfume our elbows." Except now, they did. Even those who resisted the oil couldn't resist the effect. Morale, despite the endless marching, was shockingly stable. Soldiers slept better. Skin infections dropped. Arguments during mealtime decreased, if only because people were too busy sniffing their wrists and humming. The joke became, smell too nice, and you'll get sent to the front lines. The enemy might surrender just to ask where you got that cedar musk. Even bards and poets in the camp got in on the act. One wrote a limerick that went something like, "A warrior once smelled of despair, till he bathed in a tent with great care. Now his sword is quite clean, and he smells like a queen, but his enemies still do beware." They performed it at feasts. Even Alexander laughed, though his chuckle came with a side of "maybe don't push it." By this time, the perfumed baths were no longer rare events. They became routine, woven into the rhythm of the campaign. Small stations set up with quick wash basins, mini flasks of oil handed out like candy, a rotating team of bath attendants who somehow always had just enough towels. And yet, beneath it all, the division remained. The old guard still muttered. Philosophers still pouted. Even a few Eastern allies raised eyebrows when the oil blends leaned too heavily on foreign ingredients. "Too piney," one priest complained. "Smells like a confused forest." But Alexander didn't flinch. He knew that legacy wasn't built on appeasement. It was built on blend, of conquest and culture, of East and West, of steel and scent. And so the baths continued, the jokes multiplied, the skeptics huffed, but the army marched on, softer in scent, sharper in unity, stronger in spirit, and smelling increasingly like destiny. The sun sets with a sigh. Not a dramatic blaze of glory, just a soft fade into rose gold and blue, like someone gently dimming a lamp over the entire desert. You sit on a worn blanket, cross-legged, watching as the last light settles over the tents. The air cools, the wind quiets, the scent of crushed mint leaves and lingering bath oil dances just beneath your nose. And in the distance, you hear laughter. Not loud, more like the kind of chuckle people make when they're full, tired, and a little bit in awe of the quiet around them. You smile. This is what it's all been leading to, hasn't it? The baths, once a footnote, a quirk, a strange indulgence, are now a fixture of life. Not every night, no. Sometimes there's only time for wiping off with a sleeve and falling into your dreams. But when the oils come out, when the basins are filled and the stones warmed, something subtle shifts in the camp. It becomes a community again. Not a war machine. Not a steel-clad juggernaut. A collection of people who've carried each other through mountains and sand, through freezing passes and flooded rivers, through heartbreak and boredom and fleeting, ridiculous joy. And all of it smells faintly of thyme. Even Alexander seems softer these days. Still a legend, yes, but one with cracked hands and sunburnt ears, who lingers longer in the bath tent than he used to. A man who listens when his officers speak, even if he still insists on being oiled in a very specific order. One record, probably fictional, but who cares, describes a moment where Alexander, mid-bath, asked his attendants, "What do you smell?" They paused. "Lavender? Wine? Maybe dust?" "No," he said, "the future." A little dramatic, but also not wrong. Because by now, the fragrance that clings to this army, this strange, unstoppable force, is more than a scent. It's a symbol of change, of fusion, of a vision that smells like no one place, no one culture, but something entirely new. Historians still argue about what Alexander wanted most. Glory? Immortality? A world under one name? Maybe. But maybe, in those quieter nights, when sandalwood swirled through the air and his soldiers laughed in rose-scented tents, he wanted something smaller, stranger, gentler, a memory that didn't rust. Because scent, unlike empire, lingers quietly. Tonight, you breathe deep and feel it all. The scratch of the blanket under your fingers. The faint pull in your calves from this morning's march. The rich, warm smell of oil and dust and quiet camaraderie. The fire crackles. Someone plucks a lute, someone else snores rhythmically. And above you, the stars blink slowly, just as they did the night Alexander was born. Just as they will long after his name is a footnote in a scroll. But tonight you are here. You are clean. You are soft. And somehow, in the middle of a never-ending war, you feel human again. And now, as the scent fades and the fire burns low, you let your mind soften. No more marching, no more maps, just the slow, steady rhythm of breath and time. You feel your limbs heavy with rest. Your eyes blur at the edges. Even the memory of that basil-scented towel is enough to lull your senses toward stillness. The wind picks up just slightly, brushing past your face with the gentleness of a friend's hand. You're not cold, just aware. Soft fabric, warm skin. That faint fragrance that makes you feel known. In this moment, you are not a warrior, not a conqueror, not a name on a list. You are a small breath in a wide world. And that's enough. You think distantly about how scent carries memory. About how years from now someone may crush a leaf in their palm and be transported back to this very night, the stars, the warmth, the quiet, the peace. So let it go. Let the world drift. Let the fire crackle. Let the desert hold your dreams like an old, careful friend. And if you still carry a bit of that jasmine on your skin, let it carry you gently into sleep. Good night, traveler. You've earned your rest.